Over the last 20 years of doing this work, I have talked to countless folks about Zionism, and it is so common for leaders in the Jewish community, even leaders with extensive Israel experience, to think that Zionism is primarily about creating a safe haven for the Jewish people because of anti-Semitism in Europe and because of the Holocaust. In reality, Zionism is dramatically more complex, compelling, and interesting than this singular example. Moreover, Zionism is not and has never been one thing. But aside from all the political talking points, let's dive into a fact-based and historical look at what Zionism really is. First of all, the dream of the Jewish people returning to the land of Israel from centuries of exile was always part of the Jewish religion. It shows up in a few places in ancient prayers that Jews recite multiple times per day, as well as in the well-known line that ends the Passover Seder next year in Jerusalem. That said, Zionism only became a political movement in the 19th century. It's common for us to think that all of Zionism was about creating a safe haven for the Jews, but as we dive into this, what we'll see, it really only represents a small sliver of what Zionism is. The story of Zionism really starts with a watershed moment called the Emancipation. In 1791, France was the first nation to emancipate the Jews and grant them equal rights with all other French citizens. This is really the first time that the Jewish community in Europe, that dates back all the way to the 4th century, were given the chance to have full access to European society. Before this, Jews lived outside the official structure of European life and could only live in a place with the permission of the host culture. As leaders and conditions changed throughout the centuries, Jews were often forced to flee and relocate. This idea of making Jews full citizens of Europe spread through other parts of Europe as well, and eventually Jews were able to become active members of European society. The emancipation created a kind of existential crisis for Jewish identity. For the first time in history, Jews were able to ask, what does it mean to be Jewish? Or how Jewish do we want to be? Before this, it was a legal category set by the host culture. This is the birth of what we call the modern Jewish question, or the modern Jewish problem. Could they ever fully integrate into European society, or would Jews always remain a separate people? There were three major responses to this new identity crisis. The first is that some Jews wanted to fully assimilate and stay in Europe. Fundamentally, they believed that Jewish identity and national identity were compatible. This approach is seen among the Jews who became secular, or the leaders who started the Reform movement. This is especially true in Western Europe. A second approach was to self-isolate and self-impose barriers, the same ones that always existed, so that Jewish life could remain unchanged, even in this new moment. This approach came to be known as orthodoxy, and we see this really being popular in Eastern Europe. The final approach believed that neither assimilation nor self-imposed barriers could keep Jews safe and thriving in Europe. Instead of trying to make life in Europe work, a new idea emerged, Zionism, that believed that the only future for the Jewish people was to establish their own state, just as other European peoples were doing. But there's another important idea that undergirds Zionism that we really have to point out here. Part of it was not just responding to the emancipation, but it was the fact that Jews internalized many of the anti-Semitic tropes built into European society, tropes that saw Jews as in some way abnormal or broken. This, mixed with the prevailing ideas of European nationalism, set the stage for Zionists imagining that the only way to make the Jewish people normal was to establish a Jewish state. Now, I know this language of normal may seem strange and even a little off-putting, but it's also quite fascinating. Let me show you a few examples of how this played out. It not only helps fill out the picture of what Zionism really is, but also these ideas respond to many of the same questions that are present for anybody living as a Jew in the modern world, So they actually offer us some insight and inspiration to some of the struggles of what it means to be a Jew living in a non-Jewish society. The first of these responses, and perhaps the best known, is called political Zionism, and it was founded by Theodor Herzl in the 19th century. Herzl believed that no matter how much Jews tried to integrate into European life, they would always be separated through some psychological barriers. At the end of the day, the host culture would never fully accept Jews as part of their society, and deep down, Jews themselves would always sense that they were different. Therefore, the only solution to make Jewish life normal was to establish a place where Jews could be the majority and live in safety on their own terms. Interestingly, Herzl wasn't convinced that this place had to be the land of Israel. In fact, Herzl even entertained something called the Uganda Plan. This was a plan that would have established a Jewish state in Africa. Ultimately, this idea was rejected by the World Zionist Congress, but it gives you a sense of how committed Herzl was to the idea of Jews needing their own place above all things. A second approach to Zionism and making the Jews normal is called cultural Zionism. Echad Ha'am was the most influential thinker in this school. He rejected the idea of Jews as a people of the book. For him, this meant that rather than living a full, three-dimensional life, Jews lived in books, in words, and in ideas rather than an embodied life. Echad Ha'am saw the fact that Jews existed as an ultra minority, always struggling to survive, as the main source of their incomplete existence. Rather than remain a people of the book, he believed the only way to make the Jews normal again was to have a land and a society and a place where Jews could become a people of action. The last thing that's worth mentioning about Echad Ha'am is that he didn't envision a world where all Jews had to live in Israel. Rather, he saw a world where the diaspora would continue to live outside of a thriving Jewish community in Israel. In a moment that now seems almost prophetic, Echad Ha'am describes how Israel would act as a kind of magnetic center for Jews living in the diaspora, a place where Jews could go to recharge their Jewish batteries that were needed to maintain Jewish life around the world. What's amazing about this is that in many ways, his words came true. There are so many stories of people who live in the diaspora who credit a pilgrimage to Israel as one of the foundational Jewish experiences of their lives. Not only this, they feel like they need to return to Israel periodically in order to recharge and renew their connection to Jewish life. A third approach to making the Jews normal is called revisionist Zionism, and it's a school that is best exemplified by a man named Zev Jabotinsky. He is an incredibly interesting and essential character. He not only helped shape early Zionist thought, but in doing so, he helped shape the very political structure of modern Israel, and much of the mystique of Israeli military power goes all the way back to his thinking. For Jabotinsky, the way to make Jews normal was to give them the ability to defend themselves and to avoid a situation where the only choice for survival was to ingratiate themselves to a host culture. For Jabotinsky, the way to make the Jewish people normal was to give them military strength and the ability to fight back. The revisionist Zionists created new paramilitary groups that take on a much more aggressive and militaristic view about how to force the British to allow for the establishment of a Jewish state. Jabotinsky is also the intellectual fountainhead that lays the framework for the eventual Likud party, which is one of the two most powerful political parties in Israeli history. And the Likud party gives rise to political leaders like Menachem Begin, as well as the current and longest serving Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. A fourth approach to how Zionism could make Jews normal is called labor Zionism and is best exemplified by A.D. Gordon. For Gordon, the way to make Jews normal was mostly about reinventing the Jewish body and building almost a new Jew. He believed that a fully stratified society would make the Jews normal, having people both in professional jobs indoors as well as people working in manual labor. And while it's true that Jews in Eastern Europe were largely rural and worked as farmers and manual laborers, A.D. Gordon was really referencing Jews in Western Europe who tended to either have white collar jobs or spend all their time indoors devoting themselves to tech study. He believed that centuries spent indoors, sitting at desks, working, or studying, had actually warped the Jewish body, making it weak and malformed. A.D. Gordon believed that the Jewish people could return to nature with a capital N. They could break their diaspora bones and rebuild a new Jewish body. He became the intellectual fountainhead of the labor Zionist movement and inspired people in the second major wave of immigration to Israel. This includes people like the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. There are stories of labor Zionists refusing to take their asthma medication or taking their eyeglasses off so that they could stress themselves and work harder to rebuild their new Jewish bodies. Next, we have a character named Eliezer ben Yehuda. This is the person that the famous Ben Yehuda Street is named after in Jerusalem. For Ben Yehuda, the way to make the Jews normal was to have their own language. He was deeply influenced by the European ideas that emphasized that real nations needed their own national language. The same way people in Germany spoke German and people in France spoke French. He points out that Yiddish, a language spoken by many Jews in Europe, was more German and Slavic than it was Jewish. He watched the creation of a new national dictionary for the French language and the national dictionary of the English language, the Oxford English Dictionary. And these things inspired him to want to create the first modern Hebrew dictionary. His idea was that the Jewish people should be the first people in the history of humanity to bring a dead language back to life. It may seem obvious now in retrospect that Hebrew would be the national language of Israel, but at different points in Zionist history, there were debates about whether or not that language should be German or English. In the end, Hebrew won out, making it the first dead language to ever be reborn. As we've explored all of these different views on Zionism, it really is clear that Zionism isn't simple and it's not just one thing. One of the things that we often find is that when you hear from a pro-Israel activist or an anti-Israel activist, there's often an attempt to simplify these ideas as a way to either delegitimize Zionism or as a way to uplift them. But the reality is that while these simplifications may be useful for political organizing and they might make a good soundbite, they don't really describe what Zionism is. In reality, Zionism has many contradictions. It has voices that speak with soaring rhetoric about creating an ethical utopian society, and there are other voices that speak more narrowly about what the future Jewish state could be. But in the end, once we get beyond the simple talking points, we actually can get grounded in the fact that Zionism was really about Jews imagining a better future for themselves. Now that we understand some of the essential categories of what Zionism really is, we can dive in and get grounded in all of the accusations hurled at Zionism, things like colonialism or apartheid or racism. Now that we actually understand what Zionism is, we can understand how to unpack those terms better.